The strawberries were already in the little girl's hands when Lavinia Underwood finally understood that she had been loved all along. Rosalie Redmond stood at the doorway of the ranch house, 7 years old and solemn as a judge, her dark braids tied with a red ribbon that had seen better days, and in her cupped palms she held a small wooden bowl filled with the first strawberries of the summer. Wild ones, small and impossibly red, the kind that grew along the creek bed where the cottonwoods leaned over the water like old men, consulting one another. Lavinia stared at the child and felt something crack open inside her chest that she had been guarding for the better part of a year. "Papa said I could bring them to you first," Rosalie said, "but I already decided that before he said it." Lavinia pressed one hand against the doorframe to steady herself. The morning light was fierce and golden, and the whole of Redmond land stretched behind the child in every direction, and somewhere out past the barn Lavinia could hear Gilbert's voice carrying instructions to the hands about the water situation near the south pasture. His voice was calm and certain the way it always was, and hearing it now felt like a betrayal of the very worst kind. Not his betrayal, her own, because she had almost left. She had written the letter and folded it and tucked it inside her Bible, the letter that said she could not stay in a place where she did not belong, where she was not truly wanted, where everything she felt was a secret she had locked so deep inside herself that she had begun to forget it was there at all. "This is the second summer," Rosalie said, still holding the bowl out. "Last summer you came in June and Papa didn't know you would stay, but you did. And I saved them for you then too, only I was too afraid to bring them. I left them on the kitchen table and you didn't know they were for you, and I cried about it after." Lavinia crouched down until she was level with the child's serious dark eyes, eyes that looked so much like her father's that it was almost cruel. "You saved them for me last summer," she said, "even when I was still a stranger." "You were never a stranger to me," Rosalie said, with the kind of certainty that only a child or a person with nothing left to lose can produce. "I decided when Papa read your first letter aloud that you were going to be important. I just knew." The letter. The hidden correspondence. The dark past that had brought Lavinia here from Tennessee to the high plains of Colorado Territory in the spring of 1878, answering an advertisement for a schoolteacher at the Sutter Creek schoolhouse. An advertisement that made no mention of a widower rancher with a daughter who would sit in the front row and watch everything Lavinia did with those enormous, devastating eyes. Lavinia took the bowl from Rosalie's hands. The strawberries were warm from the morning sun, and they smelled like the best version of every summer she had ever known, and she held them carefully and thought that if she could survive this, if she could survive being loved so simply and so completely by this child, she might be brave enough to let herself be loved by the man who had raised her. She heard his boots on the porch steps before she saw him. The sound hit her like a forced choice she had been avoiding for 11 months. She stood up. Gilbert Redmond stopped 3 feet away from the door, hat in his hand, dark hair damp at his temples from the early work, and he looked at the bowl in her hands and then at his daughter's expectant face and then at Lavinia, and everything he never said was written in plain language across the angles of his face. "She told you about last summer," he said. "It was not a question." "She did," Lavinia said. "I should have told you myself." He turned the hat slowly in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as his particular form of vulnerability, the one he allowed himself only when he believed he was not being watched too closely. "I should have told you a great many things a great deal sooner, Miss Underwood." That was the moment. That was when Lavinia understood that the letter in her Bible was as good as burned. She was not leaving Sutter Creek. She was not leaving Rosalie. She was not leaving Gilbert Redmond, who was the most stubborn, guarded, decent man she had ever encountered in her 26 years on this earth. What she did not know yet, standing in that warm June doorway with wild strawberries in her hands, was that before the summer was over she would learn the full weight of his dark past, face a danger neither of them had anticipated, and have to make the ultimate sacrifice of the one thing she had kept more hidden than anything else: her pride. But that moment was still weeks away. First came the memory of how she had arrived here, a stranger on a stage from Denver, carrying everything she owned in a single trunk, and a secret in her heart that she had not told a single soul. Lavinia Underwood had left Tennessee in the autumn of 1877 because she had no choice and no one left, which is its own particular kind of freedom. Her father had died in the late summer, leaving behind a modest debt and a reputation that had curdled in the years following the war. Her older brother Marcus had taken what there was and gone west without a word. She had spent her girlhood in a town that had loved her father before the war, and regarded him afterward with a suspicion that transferred easily to his daughter. And she had spent her young womanhood teaching the children of those suspicious families in a schoolhouse that paid her $40 a year and a grudging respect. She was good at teaching. She was patient and inventive, and she genuinely loved children, which she thought was the only useful thing about herself that she could say with confidence. She was not, she was perfectly aware, the kind of woman men fought duels over. She was plain-spoken and tall for a woman of that era, brown-haired and gray-eyed, with hands that showed the work she did, and a way of looking at people directly that some men found forward and others found frightening. She had seen the notice about the Colorado position in a newspaper that a traveling merchant had left at the general store. The Sutter Creek School District was offering $50 a month to a qualified teacher willing to relocate to a ranching community in the mountains east of Denver. She had written her letter of application with the kind of desperate hope she usually reserved for prayers, and 3 weeks later she received a reply from the school board chairman, one Edward Tully, who informed her that the position was hers and that accommodations had been arranged with a local family. She did not know until she arrived, dusty and hollow-eyed from 6 days of travel, that the accommodations in question were the spare room in the home of Gilbert Redmond, who was on the school board and who had, according to Edward Tully's cheerful explanation at the stage stop, the largest house in the district and no wife to make the arrangement complicated. The no wife part was true. What Edward Tully had not mentioned was that the wife's absence was a wound that had not fully closed, that it was 3 years recent, and that it had reshaped Gilbert Redmond from whatever he had been before into the particular form of man that Lavinia encountered the evening she arrived. He had been standing in the yard when the supply wagon that had carried her from town rolled up to his gate. He was not hostile. He was not warm. He was somewhere in the space between those two territories, which she later understood was where he lived permanently, and he had helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the porch with the economical courtesy of a man who had been raised to be decent, and was going to be decent whether it suited him or not. "Welcome to Sutter Creek," he had said. "My daughter Rosalie will show you your room. Supper is at 6. And then he had gone back to whatever work he had come from, and Rosalie, appearing silently at Lavinia's elbow in the way that small children and barn cats often did, had looked up at her with those enormous eyes and said, "I'm very glad you came. Papa said I shouldn't say that because it sounds too forward." Lavinia had looked down at her. "I think it sounds like honesty," she said. "I'm glad I came too." Rosalie had smiled then, a real smile that crinkled her eyes and showed the gap where her left front tooth had been, and Lavinia had felt something shift inside her that she had been holding absolutely rigid for longer than she could remember. The first months were a careful negotiation. She taught school 5 days a week, 6 children in various stages of learning, and she rode to the schoolhouse each morning on the small roan mare that Gilbert had offered without comment, and returned each afternoon to help Rosalie with her lessons and whatever else wanted doing around the house. The housekeeper, a broad and capable woman named Mrs. Elara Finch, managed the cooking and the washing and treated Lavinia with a frank evaluation that eventually resolved into respect when Lavinia proved she was not going to faint at the sight of hard work. Gilbert was there in the mornings and evenings and rarely at midday. He was building fence through that autumn, expanding his grazing range, and he came in at supper smelling of sawdust and soil and Colorado cold, and he ate and spoke about the land and the cattle and the weather, and he asked Lavinia about the school, and he listened when she answered, which was more than she had expected. She noticed early that he was intelligent in the way that men who have no formal education often are, broadly and practically, having read everything he could lay hands on, and having spent years watching how water and grass and cattle and weather interacted with each other in ways that no book had thought to describe. He had opinions about things, and he expressed them flatly and without apology, and when she disagreed with him she said so, which surprised him the first time, and seemed to interest him very much the second time, and became something she slowly came to understand he looked forward to. Rosalie noticed everything. Children of that age, particularly solitary children on ranches far from other children, develop a particular species of emotional radar, and Rosalie Redmond's was extraordinary. She watched her father when he talked to Lavinia. She watched Lavinia when she thought no one was looking. She arranged small logistical coincidences. A missing harness left in the barn, so her father had to go in while Lavinia was watering the mare. An arithmetic problem she could not manage that required both of them at the kitchen table at the same time. Lavinia saw all of it and said nothing, because she understood what it meant, and because some part of her was terribly grateful for the child's uncomplicated love. Winter came to the high plains with a seriousness that Lavinia had not been prepared for. The snows arrived in November and did not relent. The ranch became its own world for weeks at a time, the nearest town invisible behind white walls of wind-driven cold, and the three of them existed in the warmth of that house in a closeness that was equal parts comfort and difficulty. She had not lived in such proximity to another adult in years, certainly not an adult like Gilbert Redmond, who had moods that moved through him the way weather moved through a valley, visible from a distance, and difficult once you were inside them. She learned his dark past in pieces. It was not given to her as a coherent story, but assembled slowly the way you piece together a quilt from scraps, each piece telling you a little more about the original material. She learned about his wife from Mrs. Finch first, in the oblique way that loyal women protect the reputation of the dead. Her name had been Clara. She had come from Pennsylvania, a merchant's daughter, brought west by a young man's ambition and her own sense of adventure, and she had loved it here, the land and the sky, and the particular quality of light that came off the mountains in late afternoon. She had died in the winter of 1875 of a fever that started as a cold and became something else before the doctor could be fetched from town through the snow. Rosalie had been 4 years old. Gilbert had been 30. Lavinia was 26 when she arrived, which made him 10 years older than her. Not an impossible gap for the era, but a real one, and she was aware of it sometimes in the way she was aware of the mountains, as a constant presence that shaped the landscape without being the thing you were looking at. She was aware of other things too. She was aware that he had closed himself off around the loss in a way that had served him efficiently for 3 years, and was showing its costs now. He was not unkind to Rosalie. He was attentive and protective, and he read to her every night without fail, which was the detail that had dissolved Lavinia's last reasonable defense. That image of him in the chair by the fire with his daughter on his knee, and some battered volume of natural history or adventure stories in his big hands. He was not a perfect father, but he was a devoted one, and the devotion was sincere in a way that Lavinia had rarely encountered in men who claimed it. What he was not doing, she observed, was letting his daughter close enough to break him if something happened. There was a small, fatal distance he maintained even in his warmth, and Rosalie felt it the way children feel everything, without being able to name it, and it made her try harder to reach him, and the trying made him retreat another fraction of an inch, and the whole painful cycle had been running for 3 years before Lavinia arrived. She did not intend to intervene. It was not her place, and she knew it. But in December, when Rosalie woke with a nightmare and came to her room instead of her father's, and Lavinia held the trembling child and sang the songs she remembered from her own childhood. She heard Gilbert step outside her door, and then the long silence as he stood there not entering, and she understood that he was standing outside the door of something much larger than a room. In the morning, she said nothing. She simply made sure to leave the kitchen before Rosalie came down so that he would be alone with her, and she walked to the barn in the cold blue light and stayed there longer than the mare required. And when she came back in, she could hear him talking to Rosalie in a different tone, softer, and she told herself she had imagined the change. She had not imagined it. January brought the thaw, and the thaw brought mud, and the mud brought a rancher named Curtis Hollowell from 3 miles east, a big, red-faced man with small eyes and large ambitions who came calling ostensibly about a water rights dispute, but who spent a significant portion of his visit looking at Lavinia with an appraisal she recognized and did not care for. He was not violent. He was merely the kind of man who believed that a woman without obvious protection was a problem to be solved for his own benefit, and he had decided that Lavinia was a solution to his own domestic inconvenience. He had 3 children from a previous marriage and a house that needed a woman in it, and he did not appear to consider that Lavinia might have preferences in the matter. He came back twice in February. The second time Gilbert was in the yard when he rode up, and whatever passed between the 2 men in Lavinia's absence settled the matter, because Hollowell did not come back a third time. Gilbert did not tell her about it. She heard it from Mrs. Finch, who heard it from her cousin who worked Hollowell's place, that Gilbert had told Hollowell in language that was brief and unambiguous that Miss Underwood was not available for his consideration, and that if he came back with the same purpose in mind, there would be consequences that Hollowell would not find comfortable. When Mrs. Finch told her this, in the spring when the first wildflowers were pushing through the mud near the creek, Lavinia sat very still for a moment and then said, "He had no right to speak for me." Mrs. Finch looked at her with the expression of a woman who has watched this particular situation develop from a considerable vantage point. "No," she said. "He did it anyway." Lavinia thought about that for a very long time. Spring turned the ranch into something almost impossibly beautiful. The grass came in green and thick, and the cottonwoods leafed out, and the creek ran high and cold with snowmelt. And Lavinia taught school and rode the roan mare and helped Rosalie with her letters and numbers, and she and Gilbert developed a habit of sitting on the porch in the evenings after Rosalie was in bed. It was not courtship. She was clear with herself about that. It was 2 people who lived in the same house and had run out of ways to avoid each other, and had discovered that they did not, in fact, wish to avoid each other. He talked about the land sometimes, the history of it, the way it had looked when he first came through in 1868 and the changes since. He had been 23 then, come west from Ohio with a small inheritance and a complete absence of anything to keep him in Ohio, and he had found this valley and known immediately that this was where he intended to stay. He had built the first structure himself, a 1-room cabin that was now his barn, and the house had grown in stages as the cattle operation grew. She talked about Tennessee, about her father and his particular dignified obstinacy, and the way the community had treated him after the war, a man who had refused to take a side and been accused of cowardice by both the sides he had refused. About Marcus, who had taken the same stubbornness in a different direction and simply left. About the schoolhouse and the children and the way teaching had felt like the one thing she was built for, the one place where she was entirely herself. She did not tell him about the specific secret she had carried from Tennessee. That would come later and not by her choice. In April, she received a letter. The letter was from a man named Daniel Archer, who was a lawyer in Memphis, and it contained information about her brother Marcus that she had not expected, and that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about why she had come west. Marcus, it turned out, had not vanished into the wilderness without a word. Marcus had been looking for her. Marcus had been sending letters to the family house in Tennessee, not knowing she had left, and when he had finally discovered through their father's former lawyer that she had gone west to Colorado, he had engaged Daniel Archer to find her and relay a message. The message was this: Marcus had done well for himself in Colorado. He had been in Colorado for 2 years, and he had a small but functional claim near a mining settlement north of Denver, and he was not rich, but he was not in difficulty either, and he wanted his sister to know where he was and that he was alive, and that he was sorry he had left the way he had. He wanted to see her. She held this letter for 3 days before she told anyone about it. On the 4th day, she told Rosalie, who was the easiest person she had ever told anything to, and Rosalie said, "Is Marcus nice like you?" And Lavinia said she honestly did not know, but she hoped so, and Rosalie considered this and then said, "You should go see. Papa can take you." She did not immediately take this suggestion to Gilbert, who she suspected would have practical objections. What she did not anticipate was that Rosalie would take the suggestion to him herself. She came in from the barn the following afternoon to find Gilbert in the kitchen with a particular expression on his face, the one that meant he had received information through an unauthorized channel and was deciding how to respond to both the information and the channel. "Rosalie tells me you have family north of Denver," he said. Lavinia sat down across the table from him. "She is the most efficient intelligence operation in this county," she said. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "She is that." He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," she said, which was the truth. "It's a long way. 3 days by horse if the weather holds, 2.5 on the stage from town." He paused. "I could take you. I need to see a man in Denver about some cattle business. It would make sense to go at the same time." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and it was one of those rare, dangerous moments when neither of them was being careful, and she could see what was underneath the carefulness very clearly, and she suspected he could see the same in her. "All right," she said. "Yes, let's go." The trip to Denver was 4 days. Mrs. Finch stayed with Rosalie, who gave Lavinia a long and emphatic embrace before they left, and whispered in her ear that she should tell Papa about the letter she kept in her Bible. And Lavinia pretended not to have heard because she was not ready to explain the letter in her Bible to anyone. The stage from Sutter Creek to Denver was not comfortable. It was the kind of transport that required philosophical acceptance of physical discomfort as a condition of existence, and Lavinia had made peace with that before she boarded. What she had not made peace with was 6 hours of close proximity to Gilbert Redmond in a space approximately the size of a generous closet, with 2 other passengers who got out at a station 2 hours in and left them entirely alone. They talked for some of it. About the country they were passing through, about the cattle market in Denver, about a book she had recently acquired from the school board's small library, a geography of North America that had given her a better picture of where she now lived. He had questions about Tennessee that he asked with the directness she had come to expect, and she answered them. And somewhere in those answers she found herself talking about her father in a way she had not talked about him before, not just the facts but the weight of him, how much she had loved him, and how much his death had cost her, and how leaving had been the only way to grieve properly, because the place itself would not let her. Gilbert was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "When Clara died I couldn't leave. Rosalie needed me here. Sometimes I thought leaving might be the thing that let me breathe again, but there was no leaving." He paused. "I think staying too long in grief makes you believe you're keeping something alive when you're really just keeping yourself from living." She did not say anything immediately. The stage rattled and swayed around them. "Is that what you've been doing?" she asked. He turned and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something unguarded and a little raw. "Probably," he said. They stopped for the night at a way station, separate rooms and a thin wall between them, and Lavinia lay awake in the dark listening to the horses outside and thinking about his voice saying probably and what it cost him to say it. Denver in 1878 was a city in the process of deciding what it intended to be. It had survived the gold rush excitement and settled into something more permanent, brick buildings going up alongside wooden ones, a sense of ambition that was both exciting and a little overwhelming after months in the quiet of Sutter Creek. Gilbert's cattle business took most of the first day, and she spent it at the hotel writing a letter to the lawyer in Memphis to pass along to Marcus with her current location. And in the afternoon she walked the streets and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has lived quietly and then returned to a crowd. She found Marcus on the third day. He had come down from his claim when he received her message, and he arrived at the hotel in the late morning looking like a man who had worked very hard for a long time in difficult conditions and was quietly proud of surviving it. He was thinner than she remembered, and his dark hair was longer, and he had a quality of attention that she recognized as something she also had, a way of noticing everything, a legacy from their father. They sat in the small hotel dining room and talked for 3 hours and rebuilt the thing between them that had been damaged when he left. She did not forgive him all at once, and she told him so, and he did not ask her to. He said he had been wrong to leave the way he had, and that he would have come back for her sooner if he had known the state of things, and she believed him because he had always been a terrible liar, and everything about him now was sincere and a little abashed. She told him about Sutter Creek and the school. She told him about Rosalie. She described Gilbert as the rancher she boarded with, and then stopped and listened to herself and said, a little more carefully, that he was a man she had come to respect very much. Marcus looked at her with the same expression he had always used when he knew more than he was saying, which was an expression that had infuriated her for most of their shared childhood. "Just respect," he said. "Don't," she said. He smiled. It was their father's smile, and it hit her square in the chest, and she had to look at the table for a moment. Gilbert came to find her at 4 in the afternoon, and she introduced them, and the two men regarded each other with the measuring quality that men of that era and that type brought to new acquaintances, trying to determine what category of person they were dealing with. Marcus apparently decided something favorable relatively quickly, because his posture changed from assessment to ease in a way that Lavinia recognized. They had supper together, the three of them, and something about watching Gilbert with Marcus helped her see him differently. He was easy with a man he respected, funny in a dry, understated way she had caught glimpses of in the months of porch evenings, interested in Marcus's account of the mining life, without the particular variety of condescension that ranchers sometimes brought to the conversation. Marcus told a story about a mule that required Gilbert to put down his fork and press his hand over his mouth to contain his laughter, and the sound of that barely contained laugh did something to Lavinia that she was going to have to seriously reckon with at some point. On the stage home she was quieter than she had been on the way there. Gilbert let her be quiet for an hour and then said, "Good to see him." "Yes," she said. "He'll be all right." "I know." She looked out at the planes moving past the window. "He said something to me before we left. He said he thought I had found somewhere worth staying." She paused. "He doesn't say things like that unless he means them." She felt rather than saw Gilbert go still beside her. "Has it been," he said, "worth staying?" "Yes," she said, "more than I expected." They were quiet after that for a very long time, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, fuller and warmer, and when the stage hit a rut and she was thrown slightly against his shoulder and he did not move away, she did not move away either. Back in Sutter Creek, summer arrived in earnest. The school term ended and Lavinia's hours were less structured, and she spent more of them at the ranch, helping with the garden, reading to Rosalie, riding out sometimes with Gilbert to check the fence lines or the water situation. He was teaching her, she realized gradually, not in a deliberate instructional way but in the way he did most things, by simply doing them in front of her and letting her watch and ask questions or not as she chose. She learned how to read the grass to know if the moisture was sufficient. She learned how to read the sky for the particular quality of cloud that meant afternoon storms. She learned that the creek had a voice that changed depending on the volume of water, and that in high summer it dropped to a murmur that Rosalie liked to fall asleep to when they camped near it on warm nights. There was a night in late June when they sat outside long past when Rosalie had gone into bed, and the sky was doing extraordinary things with stars, and Gilbert said something about his wife that he had never said to her before. "She would have liked you," he said. "Clara. She had no patience for women who performed helplessness." He looked at the sky. "She wasn't helpless either. I thought I'd never meet another person like that." Lavinia understood what he was telling her. She understood it very precisely, and she understood the cost of it, how long he had kept that sentence inside himself, and what it had required to let it out. "I'm sorry I never knew her," she said, which was also true. "I'm sorry you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have told me much sooner than this that I was being an idiot." Lavinia looked at him. The moonlight was strong enough to see his face, and what was on it was the most honest thing she had seen there. "Were you being an idiot?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I was being a very dedicated idiot for quite a long time." The space between them had never been smaller. She felt the pull of it, the specific gravity of a moment that wants to be something, and she was about to say something true and important when boots hit the porch steps and Curtis Hollowell appeared from the dark like a problem she had thought was solved. He was not alone. There was another man with him, younger and harder-eyed, and both of them had the particular quality of people who have been drinking enough to feel justified in actions they would not normally attempt. Gilbert was on his feet before Hollowell finished climbing the steps. The easy evening was gone, and in its place was something alert and dangerous. "Hollowell," Gilbert said, flat. A warning in a single word. "Redmond." Hollowell's eyes moved to Lavinia and stayed there in a way that made her want to stand up, and did. She stood up. "I came to have a conversation with your schoolteacher." "She's not my schoolteacher," Gilbert said. "And if she wants a conversation with you, she'll arrange it at a time of her choosing." "I don't believe I want a conversation," Lavinia said, putting her voice out clearly and without any of the social softening that she had been raised to apply and had spent years removing. "I believe I want you to leave this property, Mr. Hollowell." Hollowell's face went through several registers. He had expected something different from her, she could tell, something more accommodating. The harder-eyed man behind him shifted his weight. "Word is you're not actually from Colorado," Hollowell said, and his tone had taken on the particular edge of a man reaching for a weapon he thinks is secret. "Word is there's something in your past back in Tennessee that you left behind in a hurry." Lavinia felt the cold of it before she identified what he was actually threatening, the secret she had kept, the thing she had told no one. Gilbert had not moved, but something in him had changed. She could feel it even in the dark. "Whatever you think you know," she said steadily, "you are mistaken about its relevance." "Am I?" Hollowell produced something from his coat pocket. A letter. Even in the dark she could see it was a letter, and from the shape of it she knew exactly what it was, because she recognized the handwriting on the outside. It was her handwriting. Letter addressed to a Mr. Garrett Cole in Memphis, Tennessee. Fell off a mail wagon outside of town. Man who found it thought I might find it interesting. Her stomach dropped. Not at the letter itself, but at the understanding of what Hollowell intended to do with it, which was not discuss it privately but use it publicly, use it to make her position in this community untenable, and drive her toward the alternative he was offering, which was his household and his convenience. "That letter is private correspondence," she said. "Sure is." He unfolded it. "Want me to read it here or in front of the whole town?" Gilbert took a single step forward. "Put that away," he said, and the quality of his voice had changed completely, stripped of everything except the core of what he intended, which was not a threat but a statement of fact. "You are on my land. You are uninvited. You are holding a woman's private letter and threatening her with it. You have about 30 seconds to reconsider every decision you made tonight before I help you reconsider it in a way you'll find much less pleasant." Hollowell hesitated. The man behind him looked less certain now than he had arriving. "You don't even know what's in it," Hollowell said. "I don't need to," Gilbert said. It's hers. Put it down and get off my land." There was a very long moment during which the knight held its breath. Then Hollowell set the letter on the porch rail, and he and his companion got back on their horses and rode away into the dark, and Lavinia stood listening to the hoofbeats diminish, and she picked up the letter and held it. Gilbert waited. She made herself turn and look at him. "I had a child," she said, "before I came here, in Tennessee. I was young. I was 20, and he was a man my father trusted, who I trusted because of that. And when I told him I was carrying his child, he said I was lying and left the county, and I had a boy. I had a son, and he lived for 3 months." She stopped. Her voice was completely steady. She had told this to no one, and the steadiness of her own voice in that moment was the strangest feeling she had ever experienced. "His name was Samuel. I put him in the ground outside my father's church, and I have never said his name to another person since that day." Gilbert was very still. "Hollowell got hold of the letter I wrote to Garrett Cole," she continued. "Garrett was Samuel's father. I wrote to him when my father died to tell him that his son had existed and lived and died. Not because I wanted anything from him, only because it felt wrong that the boy's father did not know." She looked at the letter in her hands. "I should have burned the letter. I should have known better." "Lavinia," Gilbert said. The sound of her Christian name in his voice, the first time he had ever used it, undid something in her that had been knotted for years. She felt it go, and she pressed her lips together. "You have said nothing that changes anything," he said. He moved toward her with a deliberateness that she recognized as what it was, a man who had decided something and was not going to be uncertain about it. "Nothing. You have a daughter," she said. "You have a household. You have a standing in this community, and I have just told you something that Hollowell is going to try to use against your reputation as well as mine." "Let him try," Gilbert said. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly, and what was on it was not pity and not horror and not the complicated discomfort she had been expecting. It was something plainer and fiercer than any of those things. "You loved your son. You carried something unbearable alone for years because you had no choice. That is not a secret you owe anyone. That is a grief that belongs to you and to no one who wasn't there." She had not cried about Samuel in 2 years. She had made herself a rule about it, that she had grieved properly and thoroughly, and had put that grief where she could live alongside it without it destroying her capacity to live. She did not cry now. But something released in her chest that she had not known was still compressed, and she breathed in, and the breath was different from any breath she had taken in a very long time. "He will go to the town," she said. "He will tell people." "He might," Gilbert said. "And people might care, some of them, and some of them won't. And I know exactly who will and who won't, and the ones who will are people whose opinions have never interested me." He stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she was going to remember for the rest of her life, direct and unarmored, like a man who has finally set down something very heavy. "I told you on the stage that staying was worth it. Or I meant to and was slow about getting there. I'm asking you to keep staying, not because you have nowhere else to go, because I want you here, because Rosalie wants you here, because this is the first year in 3 years that this place has felt like it's alive again, and that is because of you." She looked at him for a long time. The letter from Hollowell was in her hands, and the night was around them, and the stars were still doing extraordinary things. "Gilbert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Say it plainly," she said. "I need you to say it plainly." He reached over and took the letter from her hands and set it on the rail, and then he took both her hands in his, which were large and warm and calloused in specific places she had catalogued without meaning to, and he said, "I love you, Lavinia. I have been in love with you since about February, and I have been fighting it because I was afraid, and I am done being afraid. If you'll have me, I want you to stay here permanently, as my wife, as Rosalie's mother, as whatever you want to be beyond those things, because I have no interest in reducing you to a function." She thought she might laugh, but it came out as something else, something closer to relief, and she turned her hands in his and held on. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you. I'll stay." He kissed her then, carefully at first and then not carefully at all, and the night was warm and full of stars, and somewhere inside the house Rosalie was asleep with her dark braids on the pillow and her gap-toothed smile waiting for morning. The morning did come, as mornings in the West had a way of doing, with a particular golden insistence, and with it came the practical reality of what Hollowell had threatened and what they had decided, and the fact that these things were going to intersect in public before long. Gilbert rode into town 2 days later, and Lavinia insisted on coming. They had a conversation before they left in which she made clear that she was not going to hide in the ranch house while he managed her reputation on her behalf, and he looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts exasperation and admiration, and said, "I never expected you would," which was the correct answer. Edward Tully was the first person they saw at the general store, a small, round man with the perpetually startled expression of someone who has been managing community affairs for so long that actual events still surprise him. He had clearly already heard something, because he looked from Gilbert to Lavinia with the expression of a man trying to determine the weather from conflicting reports. Gilbert spoke first, in the even tone he used for things he considered settled. He told Edward Tully that he and Miss Underwood had agreed to be married, and that Tully would want to tell the Reverend to expect them before the end of the month, and that anything else Tully had heard from any quarter he could either verify with them directly or disregard as gossip, his choice. Tully blinked. "Curtis Hollowell was in here yesterday," he said. "I expect he was," Gilbert said. "He said some things about Miss Underwood's past." "People's pasts are their own business," Gilbert said. "Miss Underwood is a woman of character and an outstanding teacher, and she is going to be my wife, and anyone who has a problem with either of those facts is welcome to take it up with me directly." Tully looked at Lavinia. "Is that right, Miss Underwood?" "Every word," she said. Something settled in Tully's expression. He was, whatever his limitations, a man who preferred clarity to ambiguity, and clarity had just been provided. "Well," he said, "congratulations are in order then. I'll tell the Reverend." Hollowell made his play 2 days later at the community meeting that was held the first Monday of every month at the church. He stood up when the general business was concluded, and he said his piece about Lavinia's past with the careful framing of a man who is pretending to be concerned about community morality while pursuing his own damaged pride. He was not a clever man, but he was a persistent one, and he laid out what he knew in a way designed to do maximum damage. He had not accounted for Mrs. Elara Finch. Mrs. Finch stood up before he had finished his second sentence, and she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who has strong opinions and the lung capacity to make them known to a considerable distance, that she had worked in the Redmond household for 4 years and had known Miss Underwood for 12 months, and that she could attest from close and daily observation that Miss Underwood was honest, hard-working, warm-hearted, and precisely the kind of woman this community needed both in its schoolhouse and in the Redmond family, and that she personally had known of Miss Underwood's history for some months and had kept it private because it was private, and that anyone who thought differently about a woman for having loved unwisely at 20 years old in circumstances that were manifestly the fault of the man involved was the kind of fool that time and experience would eventually correct, though possibly not soon enough. There was a silence after this speech. Then old Margaret Drury, who was 90 years old and had no patience for anything except her garden and her grandchildren, said from the back of the church in a voice like dried corn, "Sit down, Curtis." And Curtis Hollowell sat down. It was not the complete and permanent end of the difficulty. A few families chose a cooler distance for a time, and Lavinia was aware of it and noted it and did not allow it to alter her behavior in any direction. She continued to teach school. She continued to ride into town on the roan mare. She continued to live her life as though the opinions of Curtis Hollowell were precisely as relevant to her future as the weather opinions of last winter, which was to say she noted them and moved on. The wedding was in July, at the church in Sutter Creek, on a morning so bright that the light seemed to be demonstrating something. Rosalie was the only attendant Lavinia needed or wanted, and the child wore a white dress that Mrs. Finch had made from a bolt of cotton from the general store, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered herself from the creek bank at dawn, and she held Lavinia's hand through the whole of the ceremony up until the point when the Reverend indicated that Gilbert was required to hold it instead. Gilbert, when Lavinia came down the short aisle of that small church, looked at her with an expression that she stored in the permanent collection, the one she kept in her chest alongside Samuel's name and her father's smile and the smell of the ranch in early morning. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot believe he is allowed to have, not with the possessiveness she had feared, but with a wonder that was unguarded and complete. She said her vows clearly and without trembling. He said his in the same even tone he used for things he considered settled, which meant they were the most serious words he had ever spoken. Rosalie cried. Mrs. Finch produced a handkerchief with suspicious readiness. They rode back to the ranch together, the three of them, in the wagon that Gilbert had cleaned and decorated in the only concession to ceremony that he had made without being asked. A couple of wild roses tucked into the harness leather, already wilting in the July heat but present. That evening, after Rosalie was in bed, they sat on the porch together in the warm dark as they had been doing for months, except that now they were sitting closer than they had before, and Gilbert's arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning into his side with the ease of a woman who has decided to stop holding herself upright by force of will and accept the support that is being freely offered. "I keep expecting to feel differently," she said. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like myself," she said, "which is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, less like myself, more like something had changed." He considered this. "I think you're more yourself than you were when you arrived," he said. "I think some of what was here was just waiting to have space." She thought about that. About the versions of herself she had compressed and managed and performed and protected over the years, the one that did not say too much, the one that did not grieve publicly, the one that did not want too obviously for fear of losing what she wanted by wanting it. "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." He kissed her hair and she felt his breath and the warmth of him and the dark around them, and the stars did their patient, extraordinary work overhead. Summer moved through its heat and began its slow lean toward autumn. Lavinia learned more of the ranch, more of the land, more of Gilbert's particular rhythms and moods, and he learned hers, and the learning was not always easy, but it was real, which was better. There were mornings when they disagreed about significant things with the full force of two people who had strong opinions, and there were evenings when they repaired those disagreements with the same honesty they had used to make them. And there were quiet afternoons that belonged to no category except happiness, which Lavinia was slowly learning to receive without bracing for its withdrawal. Rosalie expanded into the new shape of the family, with the contentment of a plant that has finally been put in the right soil. She was more openly affectionate with her father now in a way that had been developing all year, something having released in him that allowed him to hold her more easily, hold on a little longer, be present in the ways he had been withholding from them both. Lavinia watched this happen, and it was among the best things she had ever witnessed. The school term began again in September. Lavinia was now Mrs. Redmond to the students, which some of them navigated with varying levels of grammatical success, and to her slight surprise, the cooler families proved to have limited staying power in their coolness. When confronted with the daily reality of a teacher, their children were attached to. The pragmatism of small communities in difficult landscapes tends to reassert itself over social principle, and by October she had received apologies from two families that were not quite explicit but were genuine in their way, and she accepted them in the spirit they were offered. Marcus came to visit in November, riding down from his claim with his mule and his good humor and a bottle of Tennessee whiskey that he presented to Gilbert with the solemnity of a peace treaty, which it was. He stayed for 2 weeks and fit himself into the household with the ease of a man who was used to finding his footing in new places, And he and Gilbert developed a genuine mutual regard over those 2 weeks that expressed itself primarily in the form of long conversations after supper about cattle and mining, and the future of the territory that Lavinia monitored from her reading chair with an affection so uncomplicated it almost alarmed her. He took her aside before he left and said, "You're happy." "I am," she said. "I thought you would be. I thought so on the stage when I watched you describe the ranch." He hugged her, which was the first time he had hugged her in years, and which affected them both more than either of them was going to admit. Father would have approved of him, of all of this. She thought that was probably true. Winter came again, and this time it came to a house that was different, not in its structures but in its interior climate, warmer in the ways that mattered and more able to withstand the external cold for it. They read together in the evenings. She and Gilbert, books passed between them with comments written in the margins, in the increasingly comfortable domestic vocabulary of two people who have stopped being careful with each other and started being known. Rosalie learned to read that winter with a dedication that astonished even Lavinia, who was experienced with children and their variable relationships with letters. The girl attacked reading the way she attacked most things she had decided mattered, which was completely. By December she was reading to them in the evenings, sounding out the longer words with her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in a gesture of concentration that was so purely her own and so purely her father's simultaneously that it made Lavinia's chest hurt in the good way. In February, Lavinia realized she was expecting. She told Gilbert on a Sunday morning in the particular quiet that Sunday mornings had on the ranch, when the work was lighter and the day had a different quality of time, and he was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she sat down across from him and told him, and he looked at her for a long moment with the careful, controlled expression he used when something had hit him more deeply than he was ready to show. And then he stood up and came around the table and held her for a long time without saying anything. And what she felt in that embrace was something she had no vocabulary for that was adequate. It was the feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do, which was a feeling she had not known she was missing until she had it. "Are you well?" he asked when he finally spoke. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm very well." "Good," he said, and then quietly, "Good." Rosalie was informed that same afternoon. The child received the information with an expression that went through several visible stages, surprise and then processing and then a slow, enormous smile, the gap-toothed one that was almost too much joy for a single face to contain. "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" she demanded. "We won't know until it arrives," Gilbert said. "I hope it's a boy," Rosalie said. "I think I would be very good at having a brother." Lavinia laughed, a real full laugh that surprised her by its completeness, and Gilbert looked at her over Rosalie's head with the expression she had come to think of as his honest face, the one that didn't manage anything, the one that was just him looking at her because she was there and that was enough. The pregnancy moved through the spring with the stubborn efficiency of Lavinia's constitution, which declined to be dramatically inconvenienced by the process. She was tired in the early months and less tired after, and she taught school until May and then stepped back from teaching to prepare the household, training a temporary replacement teacher the school board had found in Denver, a young man named Thomas Price who was earnest and adequate, and who she left very thorough notes for. The summer of 1879 arrived with the same extravagance as every summer in that valley, the cottonwoods and the creek and the enormous patient sky. And in June, Rosalie came to her room in the early morning with a small wooden bowl of wild strawberries from the creek bank. "These are the first of the summer," Rosalie said, with the gravity of a child delivering something sacred. "I saved them for you." Lavinia was sitting up in bed with the particular heaviness of a woman who is very close to her time, and she looked at the bowl and she looked at Rosalie's dark eyes, so exactly like her father's that it was still sometimes startling, and she understood in that moment that this was already a tradition, not something they had decided to make into one. Something that had simply become one, the way the most real things do, by being done with enough love that the repetition becomes ceremony. "You saved them for me last summer too," she said. "And the summer before," Rosalie said, which was not technically accurate in terms of delivery, "in my heart." Lavinia reached out and touched the child's face. "I love you," she said. "I know," Rosalie said simply. "I love you too. I loved you before you knew." Gilbert appeared in the doorway then, fully dressed and already showing the particular contained anxiety of a man who was aware that significant events were approaching. And he looked at the bowl of strawberries and his daughter's expression, and then at his wife. And what was on his face was the accumulated sum of everything they had built together in the preceding 2 years. The grief worked through, and the fear surrendered, and the love made ordinary in the best way, made part of the fabric of daily life. "The first strawberries," he said. "Rosalie saved them," Lavinia said. He looked at his daughter. "Good," he said, and there was something in the word, some extra resonance of approval and pride and love, that made Rosalie stand up a little straighter and smile the full smile. The sun arrived 3 weeks later, on a hot July night that rattled the windows with brief thunder, born with the same determined efficiency as his mother in all her enterprises, the entire labor taking 8 hours exactly, attended by Dr. Haber from town, who arrived with commendable speed and the calm of a man who had done this a great many times. Mrs. Finch was there, and Gilbert, who held Lavinia's hand through all of it and who she subsequently established had gone wider than the sheet at several points, but had not once let go or stepped back. The boy was healthy and loud about his health, which Dr. Haber said was an excellent sign, and he was placed in his mother's arms in the last hour of the night, and Lavinia held him and looked at him and felt the full sweep of everything, Samuel's ghost and her father's memory, and all the years of holding herself carefully, and the relief and the love, all of it present in that room at the same moment, and somehow not in conflict. Gilbert sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, and the expression on his face was not the controlled, managed version but the real one, completely open and completely overcome. "Samuel," Lavinia said. She had not planned to say it. It came out quiet and certain. "Samuel Gilbert Redmond." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Yes," he said. His voice was not steady. "That is exactly right." Rosalie, who had been permitted to sit in the hallway and who had heard everything because she was Rosalie, came in when Mrs. Finch called her and stood beside the bed and looked at her brother with enormous, serious eyes. "He's very small," she observed. "He'll get bigger," Gilbert said. "He has your nose," she told Lavinia. "He has your father's hands," Lavinia said. Rosalie considered Samuel Redmond from several angles with the thoroughness she brought to all significant assessments, and then she reached out one small, careful finger and touched his fist where it was curled against his cheek, and Samuel Redmond grasped her finger with the automatic grip of the newly arrived, and Rosalie looked at her father and her mother with an expression that was pure, uncomplicated wonder. "He already knows me," she said. "Of course he does," Gilbert said. "You're his sister." The summer moved forward. Samuel grew with the aggressive enthusiasm of a well-fed baby, and Rosalie took her role as elder sister with a gravity and affection that was deeply endearing and only occasionally intrusive. Mrs. Finch, who had announced no intentions of reducing her presence in the Redmond household, managed the practical machinery of new baby life with practiced efficiency, and Gilbert learned to hold his son with the ease that men develop not from instruction, but from simply doing it enough times that the hands understand what they're doing. Marcus came back in September to meet his nephew, and he held the baby with surprising confidence for a man who spent most of his time in a mining claim, and Samuel regarded his Uncle Marcus with the particular thoughtful expression that all babies produce, but that everyone in the family was already interpreting as specifically characteristic. The autumn was golden and generous. Lavinia returned to the school in October, bringing Samuel with her for the mornings, and arranging her schedule around his requirements with the flexible pragmatism she brought to most logistical challenges. And Thomas Price, who had proven himself a better teacher than merely adequate, agreed to take the afternoon sessions permanently, which gave Sutter Creek 2 teachers instead of 1, and gave Lavinia something she had not had in her previous professional life: the ability to teach the subjects she loved best and let someone else manage the subjects she found less interesting. The school board, under Edward Tully's bemused stewardship, approved this arrangement. Curtis Hollowell, who was on the school board, did not vote in favor but also did not vote against, which was as close as he was likely to come to acknowledgement that things had not gone the way he planned, and Lavinia accepted it as such and moved on. That winter, by the fire, with Samuel in his cradle and Rosalie reading aloud to them, both from a natural history book, Gilbert reached across and took Lavinia's hand where it lay on the arm of her chair, and he held it loosely the way he had learned she liked, not gripping but present, and she turned a page of her own book and read on, and the evening was entirely ordinary in the way that the best evenings are, entirely domestic and entirely good. The following summer, Rosalie saved the first strawberries again. She brought them in the bowl, the same small wooden bowl, on a morning in June when the creek was running clear and cold, and the cottonwoods were producing their drifts of white seeds that Lavinia had once thought was snow, and had then been charmed by the truth of. Samuel, who was nearly a year old, was in his high chair at the kitchen table, conducting experiments with a piece of bread that were more interesting to him than to anyone else. Rosalie set the bowl in front of Lavinia with the precise, quiet ceremony that she brought to it now, and then she sat down and looked at her stepmother with her father's eyes and her own very specific quality of love. "The first strawberries," she said. "Every summer," Lavinia said. "Every summer," Rosalie confirmed. "It's what we do." Gilbert came through the door behind his daughter, hat in hand, and he looked at the bowl and at the two of them, and he set his hat on the hook by the door with the deliberate economy that was one of his most characteristic gestures, and he sat down at the table and looked at his family, every member of it present in this ordinary morning, and he was quiet for a moment. "What do we do with them?" he asked. Rosalie and Lavinia looked at each other. "We eat them," Rosalie said. "Together," Lavinia said. He picked up one of the strawberries, small and warm and impossibly red, and held it between his fingers for a moment, and Lavinia thought that she could see in his face the whole distance they had traveled, the grief and the caution and the dark past that had been survived, and the hidden things that had been brought into the light, and the love that had been built not in a single dramatic moment but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. He ate the strawberry. "Every summer," he said. "Every summer," she said. Samuel banged his bread against the tray of his high chair and Rosalie laughed, and the June light came through the kitchen window at the angle. It always came at that time of morning. And Lavinia Underwood Redmond sat in her own kitchen in her own life in Sutter Creek, Colorado Territory, in the summer of 1880, and she was home. There would be more summers after this one. There would be a second son, born in the autumn of 1881, who they would name James after Gilbert's father, and James would be even louder than Samuel had been and considerably more committed to chaos in the particular way of second sons, and he would drive Rosalie to a carefully contained exasperation that was nearly identical to the expression Lavinia used when Gilbert was being obstinate, which both of them found immensely funny, and which Gilbert claimed to find insulting but clearly did not. Marcus would move closer, taking a position with a cattle operation south of Denver that brought him within a day's ride, and the visits would become more frequent, and the relationship would rebuild itself into something that resembled what it might have been if the war and its aftermath had not intervened, not the childhood closeness but something more durable, the friendship of two people who chose each other. Mrs. Finch would retire to Denver to live with her daughter when Samuel was 4 years old, a departure that was mourned by the entire household with genuine depth, and the retirement gift that Lavinia and Gilbert assembled for her, a sum of money, and a silver brooch from the jeweler in Denver, and a letter written in Rosalie's best hand that took 3 drafts to get exactly right, caused Mrs. Finch to press her handkerchief to her eyes and say that she had not come all this way to have her composure destroyed by a 9-year-old girl's penmanship. The school would grow. Sutter Creek would grow. The territory would press toward statehood, which it would achieve in 1876, which meant they were already in a state, though many of the habits of territorial life persisted, and the land would continue to do what land in that country does, which is require everything you have and give back something that cannot be measured in the same units. Rosalie would grow too. She would grow into a young woman with her father's steadiness and her mother's directness, and a way with horses that exceeded both of them. And she would grow in the knowledge that she was loved without reservation, which is the thing that children need most and which is also, Lavinia came to understand more fully every year, the thing that adults need most as well. Gilbert would age into himself the way good men do, becoming more fully what he had always essentially been, reliable and intelligent and capable of a dry humor that continued to ambush Lavinia at moments she least expected it, and continued to produce in her the laugh that he had told her once was the first thing that had genuinely surprised him about her, the laugh that came from somewhere real and gave no apology for itself. The strawberries came every June. Rosalie brought them without fail, in the same wooden bowl. On the first morning she could find them along the creek bank, and she set them on the table with the ceremony of something established and beloved, and the family ate them together in the kitchen with the morning light coming in at its particular angle, and it was tradition in the truest sense, which is to say it was love made into pattern and pattern made into ritual and ritual made into the structure that holds a life in shape. In the summer of 1883, when Rosalie was 12 years old and Samuel was 4, and James had recently celebrated his 2nd birthday with the chaotic enthusiasm that attended everything he did, Rosalie brought the strawberries in June as she always did and set them on the table, and then looked at her mother with a serious, preparatory expression that Lavinia recognized as the announcement that something significant was about to be said. "I've been thinking," Rosalie said. "Tell me," Lavinia said. "I've been thinking about the tradition." She touched the edge of the bowl. "I'm going to do this my whole life, even when I'm grown up and living somewhere else. I'm going to find the first strawberries every summer and save them, because some things should be kept even when the reason they started is already finished." Lavinia looked at her stepdaughter for a long moment. "The reason they started isn't finished," she said. Rosalie looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm still here," Lavinia said. "I'm not going anywhere." Rosalie considered this with the precision she brought to important matters, and then a slow smile broke across her face. The full one, the gap-toothed one that wasn't a gap anymore because she was 12, and the permanent teeth had long since arrived, but that was still recognizable in the way it lit her whole face. "Good," she said, "because I didn't want to stop." Gilbert appeared in the doorway in the manner he had always had, at the exact moment when the most important thing had just been said, and he looked at his daughter and at his wife and at the bowl of red strawberries between them, and he came and sat down at the table with the particular movement of a man who is claiming his rightful place at something, not taking it but joining it, and he reached out and took one of the strawberries. "First of the summer." He said, "First of the summer," Rosalie confirmed. "Well then," he said, and they ate the strawberries. And the morning was bright, and the creek was running, and somewhere outside James was doing something inadvisable that Samuel was loyally failing to prevent. And Rosalie was telling her father about the particular branch of the creek where she had found the best ones this year. And Lavinia sat at the kitchen table of her home and listened to her family talk and felt the ordinary, extraordinary weight of a life that had been, against considerable odds and through considerable darkness, and with the particular grace of being loved by people who saw you clearly, built into exactly the right shape. The letter in the Bible had long since been burned, not in grief but in release. not because what it represented no longer mattered, but because what it represented had been given its proper place, spoken aloud and received without flinching, and woven into the fabric of this life rather than kept separate from it. Samuel's name was said in this house. It was said not often and not painfully, but with the quiet acknowledgement of something real that had existed and mattered and shaped the person who was now sitting at this table in this light. Gilbert knew that. He had always, from the moment she told him, understood that Samuel was part of who she was, and he had made room for that with the same practical, unglamorous generosity he brought to everything, not as a dramatic sacrifice, but as what love actually requires, which is the acceptance of the whole person, the history and the grief and the secrets brought into the light, and the capacity for joy that persists through all of it. Rosalie did not know all of it. She was 12, and there would be a time when she was older when Lavinia would tell her more, enough to understand the fullness of the woman who had come to Sutter Creek with one trunk and a hidden grief, and had become her mother without either of them planning it, both of them simply choosing it, over and over, in the way that matters. For now she knew what she needed to know, which was that she was loved and that her family was real, and that the first strawberries of every summer belonged to her mother, and that this was right and good and would continue to be so. James came running through the kitchen door at that moment with a garden snake in his hand and a triumphant expression on his round face, and Samuel came in right behind him looking guilty in the specifically helpless way of an older sibling who has failed in preventative duty, and Rosalie said, "James Gilbert Redmond," in a voice of such precise authority that it stopped him cold, and Gilbert pressed his hand over his mouth. And Lavinia stood up and dealt with the garden snake with the same calm efficiency she brought to all unexpected visitors. The kitchen was loud and bright and alive. This was Sutter Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1883, which was not the end of anything but only a place in the middle of a long and continuing story. A story that had begun with a woman on a stage from Tennessee, with nothing she could see ahead of her, and everything she needed already on its way to her, waiting in the form of a serious little girl in the front row of a schoolhouse, and a stubborn, guarded, decent man who would take longer than necessary to say what he meant but who would, when he finally said it, mean it completely. The strawberries were eaten, and the bowl was empty, and the morning continued, as mornings in the West do, without ceremony, without announcement, simply moving forward into itself with the golden insistence that is the particular quality of that light in that country in the first days of summer. Lavinia Redmond washed the bowl and set it on the shelf where it lived, and she stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked out at the land that was hers now, the land and the sky and the creek she could hear from here, and the mountain she had come to love with the particular passion of a person who chose a place rather than being born to it. And she thought, as she had thought before and would think again, that there is a kind of life that does not announce itself as extraordinary while it is happening, that only appears that way in retrospect when you can see the whole shape of it, the way the pieces fit, and the way the difficult parts were necessary to the good parts, and the way the love was always there waiting to be received once you were willing to stop protecting yourself from it. She turned back to her family. Gilbert was explaining something about horses to James with the seriousness that her husband brought to education in all its forms, and James was listening with approximately 40% of his attention, and giving the remaining 60 to a piece of strawberry he had found in the bowl that everyone had missed, and Samuel was telling Rosalie about a bird he had seen near the barn, a red-tailed hawk that had been hunting the field mice in the south pasture, and Rosalie was listening in the attentive, interested way she listened to everything her brothers told her because she had decided early that they were her responsibility and her project, and that she intended to do right by both of them. Lavinia Redmond stood in her kitchen in the summer of 1883 and looked at all of it and held it in her chest alongside everything else she had ever held there, and she was, entirely and without reservation, happy. "Come sit down," Gilbert said, without looking up from the hoarse explanation. He always knew when she was standing and watching rather than sitting and part of it. She sat down. He glanced at her and she glanced at him, and the whole of it was in that glance. The complete history and the continuing story and the ordinary, extraordinary love that had been built in this place one day at a time, one strawberry summer at a time, one honest word at a time. James ate the last strawberry. Nobody mentioned it because there was already everything to look forward to next summer, when Rosalie would go to the creek in the early morning and come back with the bowl full of red, and set it on the table, and it would begin again. As it would always begin again. As long as they were here. Which was, they had all decided separately and together, for as long as there was.